What is up, YouTube? Well, listen, I knew here. If you'd like to support what I'm doing, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. All right? Thanks a lot. Let's get into it. Daisy Coleman, she was born on March 30th, 1997, in this little town, Albany, Missouri. She was like the second kid for Michael and Melinda Coleman, and she had three brothers, Charlie, Tristan, and Logan. Her dad was a doctor, and her mom, she was a veterinarian. The Colemans, they actually lived a pretty good life. I mean, in their old Victorian house that they'd renovated themselves. But Daisy's life, it really changed drastically when she was only like 9 years old. So in 2009, she was in a car accident with her dad, Michael, and her younger brother. They were on their way to a wrestling competition, and their car, it hit something on the road because it was icy. And Daisy's dad, he died from that. Daisy and her brother, they actually survived getting out through the back window of the car. This whole tragedy, it really became a turning point for the whole family. Losing their father, it just deeply affected Daisy and her brothers, and like driving past the accident site every day, it just became unbearable for them. So eventually, Melinda Coleman, she decided they just needed a fresh start. In 2010, the family moved to Maryville, Missouri, which is like 40 miles from their hometown. Maryville, it was just your typical small American town where, everybody knew everybody. In high school football, that was like the center of everything. The Colemans, they really hoped to find some anonymity there, a chance to start over. They rented a house, but they kept their old one in Albany just in case they ever wanted to go back. At first, it really seemed like the move was good for the family. Daisy's brothers, they got really into sports. And Daisy herself, I mean, she was this attractive blonde with a charming smile, and she quickly became popular at school. She won a few local beauty pageants and joined the cheerleading squad for the school football team. It really looked like life was finally getting better for the Coleman family after everything they'd been through. But this kind of, idyllic period, it turned out to be short-lived. The events that happened on the night of January 8th, 2012, they just forever changed Daisy's life and her family's, setting off a whole series of tragic things. On the evening of January 7th, 2012, 14-year-old Daisy Coleman, she invited her best friend, 13-year-old Paige, over for a sleepover. The girls, they watched horror movies and like secretly drank some alcohol they'd taken from the Coleman family's wine cabinet. It was, just a common teenage prank, something a lot of people might think is innocent. Around midnight, Daisy started texting with 17-year-old Matthew Barnett, who was a pretty popular player on the school football team and actually a friend of her older brother, Charlie. Matt, he invited the girls to hang out at his house. And even though it was super late, Daisy and Paige, they agreed. So, around 1 o'clock in the morning on January 8th, the girls snuck out of Daisy's house through her bedroom window. Matt Barnett and four of his friends met them. The boys drove the girls to the Barnett house where, they all crawled through a window into the basement, trying not to wake up Matt's parents who were sleeping upstairs. According to Paige, as soon as they got into the basement, Matt just started giving Daisy a lot of alcohol. Daisy, she drank glass after glass, almost without stopping. At some point, one of the boys, Nicholas, he took Paige into an adjacent room where sexual contact happened at his initiative. Meanwhile, Matt and Daisy, they went off alone into another room that had a big bed. Paige saw what was happening in that room several times when the door opened. Daisy was lying on the bed, almost unconscious, not really able to speak or move. Matt took advantage of her helpless state and engaged in sexual contact with Daisy. His friend Jordan Zay actually filmed what was happening on his smartphone camera. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the boys decided it was time to leave. They put the girls in the car and drove them back to the Coleman house. Paige got out of the car first. Matt told her that Daisy needed to sit out in the cold to sober up. The boys promised they would stay with Daisy and watch over her outside. They told Paige to go home and go to bed. Her friend, she took them at their word and left on her own. Instead, the boys took Daisy out of the car and stood her on her feet, supporting her so she wouldn't fall. The girl threw up, so they took off her shoes, took her purse and her cell phone. Then they carefully laid her on the cold ground near the house and quickly drove away, kind of fearing they might get noticed. Daisy lay outside in the 0-degree temperature for about 3 hours. She had no socks or shoes, only a t-shirt and sweatpants. Her hair was wet and frozen. Early in the morning of January 8th, 2012, around 5 o'clock, Daisy's mother, Melinda Coleman, heard a strange knocking at the door. At first, she thought it was just their dogs trying to get inside, maybe to escape the cold. But when she opened the door, Melinda saw her daughter, Daisy, just lying there on the doorstep, almost unconscious. Daisy was in critical condition. Her hair was actually frozen to the ground. She was only dressed in a shirt and sweatpants, and the air temperature, it was like around 0 degrees. The girl, she really reeked of alcohol. She couldn't speak, just cry. Melinda, she immediately called for help from her sons. The family, they carried Daisy into the house and tried to warm her up with blankets. But when she examined her daughter more closely, Melinda noticed some bruises on her legs, and she realized that something really terrible must have happened. So, using her knowledge as a veterinarian, Melinda carefully put Daisy in a bath of cool water, slowly increasing the temperature to avoid any complications from frostbite. Soon after, Melinda called the police. The officers who arrived, they examined Daisy but couldn't really get a statement from her about the previous night, just because of her condition. Instead, they listened to the account from Daisy's friend Paige, who was staying overnight at the Coleman house. The police, they thoroughly searched the house and the area outside. In Daisy's room, they found 5 plastic liquor bottles. Outside, they discovered Daisy's purse, her cell phone, shoes, and some traces of vomit. These findings, they pretty much backed up Paige's account of what happened the night before. Daisy was taken to the hospital where doctors did a thorough examination. They found bruises on her legs and tears in her perineal area. A blood test showed that Daisy's blood alcohol level was almost twice the legal limit. A few hours later, when Daisy finally regained consciousness in the hospital, she couldn't really recall the details of the previous night. The girl, she admitted that she just drunk too much and didn't deny that she'd taken alcohol from the home cabinet and run off to the boys at night without her mother's permission. So around 11 o'clock in the morning on January 8th, officers, they detained Matthew Barnett, Jordan Zay, and Nicholas Gramudis. They were charged and taken to the police station for questioning. During questioning, Matt Barnett, he didn't deny having sexual contact with Daisy that night, but he claimed it was consensual. He said that when he met Daisy and her friend Paige, the girls were already drunk. Initially, Matt denied giving Daisy anything to drink, but then he later admitted that he did pour her a few shots of liquor. Jordan Zay, he initially refused to give a statement, but then admitted to using his friend Nicholas's smartphone to record a video of Matt kissing Daisy. According to him, the video lasted about 10 seconds, and he said he deleted it after showing it to his friends. Nicholas, who had sexual contact with Daisy's friend, Paige, he was the only one who immediately fully admitted his guilt. He was sent to a juvenile detention center. Despite Sheriff Darren White's initial confidence that the case would lead to prosecution, the legal consequences of the incident, they turned out to be kind of ambiguous and, controversial. Months after the incident, in March 2012, the charges against Matthew Barnett and Jordan Zay were completely dropped. District Attorney Robert Price, he decided that the sexual contact between the young people was consensual. The video that Jordan filmed that night was never recovered, although several classmates claimed to have seen it. This decision, it sparked significant backlash in the community and beyond. Suspicions arose about possible influence on the course of the case by Matt Barnett's grandfather, Rex Barnett, who was a former member of the state legislature and had ties to law enforcement. Although Rex Barnett denied using his influence to have the charges dropped, these suspicions, they just kept circulating. Missouri state law defines sexual intercourse as non-consensual if the victim was incapacitated due to alcohol intoxication. However, despite Daisy's high blood alcohol level, this provision was not applied in this case. In the end, Matt Barnett pleaded guilty only to a misdemeanor charge of endangering the welfare of a child, not the felony charge of sexual assault. His sentence, it varies in different sources from 2 years probation to 4 months in jail, which was actually replaced with 2 years of probation. He was also required to pay the Coleman family $1,800 in restitution. The reaction of the Maryville community to these events was really mixed and often, honestly, quite hostile towards Daisy and her family. Instead of support, Daisy faced hostility and bullying from her peers. Most of her acquaintances, they kind of sided with Matt. She instantly became an outcast, withdrew into herself, trying to spend more time alone at home. Daisy was forced to leave the school cheerleading team. Her mother, Melinda, she received anonymous threats at home and at work on a daily basis. Eventually, Melinda was asked to resign from the veterinary clinic where she had worked for many years. The harassment wasn't limited to just personal contacts. A massive campaign against Daisy unfolded on social networks. Offensive hashtags were created. At one dance competition, a girl appeared in a homemade shirt with the inscription, "Matt 1, Daisy 0." This hostility from the community had serious consequences for Daisy's mental health. She began to suffer from depression and even made a suicide attempt. Pressure from the community and just, constant threats, they eventually forced the Coleman family to decide to move out of Maryville. They went back to their old home in Albany, hoping to find some peace and a chance to start over. But problems just kind of kept plaguing the family. In the spring of 2013, their empty house in Maryville, which was up for sale, actually burned down. The police couldn't determine the cause of the fire, but there were rumors that it could have been the handiwork of Matt Barnett's father. This incident, it just really heightened the sense of persecution and danger that the Coleman family felt. Interestingly, sometime later, under similarly mysterious circumstances, the house of Daisy's friend Paige also burned down. By that time, the girls had stopped communicating. Paige, she had also become an outcast at school and was reportedly suffering from nightmares for a long time. The move, it really didn't bring the expected relief to the Coleman family. Daisy, she just kept struggling with the psychological consequences of what she'd experienced. She withdrew into herself, suffered from depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. The girl who had previously led such an active social life, she was involved in sports and dance. Now she just tried to be as inconspicuous as possible. Melinda Coleman also faced serious difficulties. The loss of her job and the constant stress over the situation with her daughter really took a heavy toll on her mental state. She tried to support Daisy, but she really needed help herself too. Daisy's brothers, especially the older one, Charlie, they tried to protect their sister and support her. However, they also suffered from the consequences of this whole situation, losing friends and facing hostility at school. Despite all these difficulties, the Coleman family tried to stick together and support each other. They sought professional psychological help and tried to find new ways to cope with the trauma and move forward. Daisy Coleman's story gradually began to attract the attention of the national media. This helped draw attention to the issue of teen sexual violence and the shortcomings of the justice system in such cases. In 2016, a Netflix documentary was released that told the story of Daisy Coleman and Audrey Pott, another girl who experienced a similar situation. The film explored the theme of sexual assault, bullying, and harassment on social media, as well as their long-term consequences. Participating in the film became a way for Daisy to tell her story and draw attention to the problem. She openly talked about her experience, the difficulties she faced, and how it affected her life. Gradually, Daisy began turning her painful experience into a platform for activism. She became a prominent activist, speaking out against sexual violence and supporting other victims. In 2017, Daisy became one of the founders of the organization Safe Bay, which worked to raise awareness about sexual violence among middle and high school students. Her efforts were recognized in 2013. HuffPost named Daisy one of the 13 bravest teens of the year. She spoke at various events, gave interviews, and used her experience to help others. However, despite the outward success of her activist work, Daisy continued to struggle with inner demons. She openly talked about her struggle with depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. In her social media posts, Daisy often mentioned how hard it was for her to cope with the thoughts inside, panic attacks, and constant nightmarish memories. Her activism became a way to cope with the trauma, but it also constantly reminded her of what she had experienced. Daisy balanced between the desire to help others and the need to protect herself from re-traumatization. Despite Daisy's efforts to start a new life and her activism, tragedies continued to haunt the Coleman family. In June 2018, a new catastrophe occurred that deeply affected Daisy and her family. Her 19-year-old brother, Tristan Ash Coleman, died in a car accident. He was returning home after helping Daisy move to Colorado Springs. This loss was another blow to the family, who had already been through so many tragedies. Daisy was especially close to Tristan, considering him her best friend. In an Instagram post, Daisy wrote, expressing her confusion and profound grief, saying she didn't understand why the universe had taken him that day, but she would never stop loving him, and he would forever be her best friend, her little brother. This loss seriously affected Daisy's mental state. She continued to struggle with depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, but her brother's death deepened her emotional problems. In 2020, the situation for Daisy worsened even more. In the summer of that year, she began complaining to friends that she was being stalked by an unknown man who constantly sent her threats. This situation lasted for several months, starting in December 2019. Daisy turned to the police about this, filed reports, but it seemed she did not receive proper help. She wrote on social media that she was afraid to leave the house, couldn't walk her dog, or go to work. Daisy claimed that the stalker might have stolen the keys to her apartment and could now freely enter her home. In addition, Daisy reported that the unknown man stole her photos and registered on one of the websites where he offered intimate services for money on her behalf. This situation further increased her fear and sense of vulnerability. On August 4th, 2020, Daisy wrote a post on Twitter about being afraid to leave the house. She reported that she had stopped eating and sleeping due to constant fear. A few hours later, she published a new post on Facebook where she said that some man had come up to her house and knocked on the door. Daisy's mother, Melinda, upon reading these messages, called the Colorado police and asked them to check on her daughter. Officers arrived at Daisy's place around 4 p.m. They spent about an hour with her, listened to her story about the stalking, but didn't notice anything suspicious in her behavior. However, shortly after the police left, 23-year-old Daisy Coleman committed suicide. Her body was found at 8:30 that same evening. This tragic event shocked everyone who knew Daisy and followed her story. News of Daisy Coleman's suicide caused a wave of shock and grief among her supporters, activists, and the general public. Her mother, Melinda Coleman, reported her daughter's death by posting on social media. She wrote, conveying her deep sorrow and love, stating Daisy was her best friend and an amazing daughter, and she wished she could have taken her pain. She expressed that Daisy never recovered from what those boys did to her, and that it simply wasn't fair that her baby girl was gone. Melinda admitted that she had been fighting for Daisy's mental health for many years. She felt she had done everything possible for her beloved daughter, but it just wasn't enough. Reactions to Daisy's death were diverse. Many people expressed their sadness and condolences to the Coleman family. Activists fighting against sexual violence emphasized that her death demonstrated the long-term consequences of trauma and the critical need for better support for victims. However, there were also those who continued to attack Daisy even after her death. In particular, former Sheriff Darren White, who led the investigation into Daisy's case in 2012, made a controversial statement. He suggested that Daisy may have committed suicide at that particular moment to harm his chances of being reelected as sheriff. This statement sparked outrage in many people and ultimately led to White losing the election. Matthew Barnett, who was at the center of the events in 2012, also commented on Daisy's death. In a brief statement, he said he had no specific comments, only that it was very sad. He added that although he was doing fine, the experience of being accused of rape was difficult for him, stating he was still dealing with it but was okay. Tragically, the story of the Coleman family didn't end there. 4 months after Daisy's death, in December 2020, her mother, Melinda, also committed suicide. Before her death, she published several poignant posts on social media dedicated to Daisy. In one of them, she wrote about not having enough I love yous she could have said when she held Daisy's cold, broken, dead body. Melinda's death was another blow to the Coleman family. Only 2 sons remained from the family, the older, Charlie, and the younger, Logan. Daisy's charity organized a fundraiser to support the brothers. These tragic events sparked a new wave of discussions about the long-term consequences of sexual assault, the importance of mental health support for victims, and the need for changes in the justice system. Daisy Coleman's story has become a symbol of the fight against sexual violence and a reminder of how trauma can affect a person's life for many years. Daisy Coleman's tragic story and that of her family sparked widespread social resonance, highlighting a number of systemic problems in society and the U.S. legal system. First, This story drew attention to the issue of sexual violence among adolescents and youth. Daisy's case showed how easily violence can occur at parties involving alcohol and how important it is to educate young people to understand the concept of consent and respect the personal boundaries of others. Second, the reaction of the Maryville community to Daisy's allegations revealed deeply rooted problems in society's attitudes toward victims of sexual violence. Instead of support, Daisy faced bullying and accusations, highlighting the need for a change in public consciousness regarding these issues. Third, the handling of Daisy's case by law enforcement and the judicial system raised questions about the fairness and impartiality of justice, especially in cases where the accused have influential relatives or high social status. Daisy's activist work after the violence she experienced became an important contribution to the fight against sexual violence. The organization, Safe Bay, which Daisy co-founded, it continues to work to raise awareness about sexual violence among school and college students. And the documentary film, Audrey and Daisy, has become an important tool for drawing attention to the problem of sexual violence and its consequences. It continues to be used in educational programs and discussions about sexual violence. The deaths of Daisy and her mother, they really highlighted the importance of long-term psychological support for victims of sexual violence and their families. This has drawn attention to the need to improve the system of psychological assistance and support for those who have experienced traumatic experiences. Daisy's story has also influenced discussions about the role of social media in cases of sexual violence. On the one hand, social networks became a platform for bullying Daisy. On the other hand, they allowed her to tell her story and find support. Legislative initiatives in some U.S. states have been partially inspired by Daisy's story. These initiatives are aimed at strengthening the protection of victims of sexual violence and improving the procedures for investigating such crimes. The story of Daisy Coleman is a tragic example of how one night can change a person's life forever. It highlights numerous problems that exist in society regarding sexual violence, justice, and victim support. First of all, this story demonstrates how serious and long-lasting the consequences of sexual violence can be. The trauma Daisy experienced affected her entire future life, despite her attempts to overcome it through activism and helping others. Secondly, the reaction of the Maryville community to Daisy's allegations shows how deeply rooted myths and stereotypes about sexual violence are. Instead of support, Daisy faced disbelief and accusations, highlighting the need for better education and a change in public consciousness regarding these issues. The behavior of law enforcement and the judicial system in Daisy's case raises serious questions about the fairness and impartiality of justice. This really underscores the need for reforms in the system of investigation and trial of sexual violence cases. Daisy's story also highlights the role of social media in modern society. Point one. On the one hand, they became a tool for bullying and harassing Daisy. On the other hand, they allowed her to tell her story and find support. Daisy's activist work after the violence she experienced shows how traumatic experiences can be turned into a force for change. However, her tragic death reminds us that even the strongest activists need support and help. The deaths of Daisy and her mother underscore the importance of long-term psychological support for victims of sexual violence and their families. This should become a priority for healthcare and social support systems. Finally, this story reminds us of the importance of responsible alcohol consumption, especially among young people. The events of that fateful night could have unfolded differently if all participants had been sober. Daisy Coleman's story remains a powerful reminder of the need for ongoing work to change public consciousness, improve the legal system, and enhance support for victims of sexual violence. Her short but impactful life continues to inspire activists and advocates for the rights of victims of sexual violence around the world.